Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Tommy Tidwell. We're supposed to have a brother online, and the bottom line is we are going to go through this. We want to start off today, first off, by looking at the syllabus so everybody understands where we stand. I did send this out to everybody already, so just to kind of get you a heads up on this. What we're going to do in this class is look at what we call Hebrew History 3. We have in our Georgia School of Preaching, we divided this into Hebrew History 1, which mainly covers everything from the book of Joshua through the first 8 chapters of 1 Samuel. That takes us to the monarchy period. So that would be the time of the judges and the time of Elijah and so forth like that. Then we come to the second history, which deal with the monarchy period, which deals with everything from 1 Samuel chapter 9 through the end of 2 Chronicles 36. That's a huge amount of material to cover, but we try to cover it in that period of time. And then this part, you could go in the next room over there. Thank you. Then the last part, which is what we're covering today, covers everything that happens after the captivity, them coming back, rebuilding the temple. And we're also at the same time not only dealing with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, but if you signed up for the class, it also deals with the prophetic books, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I think to get all of these together, it helps us to understand better the prophetic books when we understand who is he preaching to and what's going on at that very same time. So we're going to try to cover all of that in this 12-week time frame, and that's part of the reason why, again, this wound up being a 2-hour class. This is history, and I know that sometimes history becomes somewhat boring to some people. I have always been fascinated about the idea of how God in his wisdom gives us this history, tells us about things eventually happening, and then actually seeing these things fulfilled in scripture and in historical accounts. So this is one of the things that increases my faith, and I can know beyond a shadow of a doubt then that God is doing what he said he was going to do, and I can trust the scriptures in that respect. So again, what I'm going to also do for you next week is I will send you, well, actually probably tomorrow, I will send you some historical notes that I have made up myself over a period of time that contain a lot of dates. That scares people. Dates scares people. Okay, they really do, because they're afraid that they are not going to remember them all. And I myself understand as well that whole idea. But there are some dates that I think are very important, especially when we kick in on the first few classes here. We're going to see that Jeremiah 25 and also Jeremiah 29 verse 11 specifically, he's going to talk about a 70-year time frame that they're going to be in captivity. We're going to be able to trace the dates from where it was until they actually go back and start rebuilding the temple. And so in that respect, I'm going to try to emphasize those particular dates in this class. I'm not going to try to emphasize everything up till that point in time. So this is mainly what we're going to try to do. And I will send you those historical notes immediately after this class tonight, but just kind of give you an idea of what's going on. So we've got a lot of material to cover: Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, as well as Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I'm going to try to give you weekly quizzes each week, just so that you could be reinforcing what you've learned. The midterm and the final, you've got to understand, I am lazy / busy. I am lazy in the fact that what I will do with the weekly test, that's where I'm going to take the midterm and final from, okay? And again, whenever you write this stuff down about 2 or 3 times, then it's going to be sticking in your mind, and that's what I'm trying to do in that respect. And again, the final will cover everything that we covered from the very first all the way to the very end. And so that's what we're striving to do as we do that. If you are taking this via online and you cannot be here for that particular class at that moment in time, I will be saving this up, and I will give you the link to YouTube where you can see it a little bit later on. Again, I know we're all, we're trying to be, we're preachers, we're elders, we get busy, we can't be here. I will upload that link and you'll be able to do it. What I'm going to ask you to do, if you're not here for that particular circumstance, I'm going to ask you to write me out notes that you've seen so that I will know that you have seen the video. And by doing it that way, then that's what the key idea is. A few other things that we've got to take care of. Again, this is for a class for credit. Both of you have asked to do this for credit, so that's what we're trying to do. That's going to go for the 36-hour certificate, and you've got to do that. Otherwise, your audit, you don't have to take any of this. But both of you have signed up for credit in that respect. You can change or drop the status for the course anytime within the first 3 sessions. Now, we did not have a session last time because, again, preacher business. So we're going to try to push this and try to see if we can get this all in before the time. The plan is we will be finishing the Thursday before Thanksgiving. So that's the plan. If you do not get finished and you don't turn the work in, then you'll be given an I for incomplete. You've got till the end of the next quarter to get all the work in. I'm not worried about you guys doing that because I know that you're going to be able to do it. And again, if you've got a hardship of some sort, if you had a wreck and you've been in the hospital for 2 weeks, that's a hardship. You know what I'm trying to say? If your wife gets sick and you're going to have to take care of her, that's a hardship. I never will forget one of the very first times that I was at Magnolia Bible College, and I had just started my work there. And I started working a little place outside of Prairie, Mississippi. So this place was up next to nowhere. That's all I can say about this. It was a rural congregation. My wife was pregnant, and we had our first child. And then 6 weeks later, she had to have her gallbladder taken out because of that whole situation. So here I was trying to take care of a baby as well as trying to take care of a sick wife. And I didn't, of course, the school I was attending was going a semester basis. I was so busy, I didn't even have time to, between preaching and taking care of the baby and all this other, I didn't hardly have time to breathe. And then I finally went back, I think 6 weeks later, and they said, "Where have you been? We thought you'd done this." And I explained what happened, and they helped me through that. And I was able to get all the work turned in that semester. And I was thankful to God they did that, and I never will forget that. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize here is the fact I'm here to help you to get the work done and to do what you need to do to learn the material. That's my job, and it's not just a job. I also love the work because I love teaching, and so this is part of it. So again, understand if you've got a problem or something like that, please let me know as soon as you can, and we're going to work through it. We'll work through it together. Last quarter, I had another person here at school, and this particular person got behind, and I just helped them through that all through the summer. They got all the material turned in. As far as I'm concerned, it's done. And that's, being a director, that kind of helps a little bit too. I do have a little bit of play in that respect. So keep that in mind. We want you to read Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi on the book. And again, we went to polish in the pulpit, and one brother said that before you ever preach on a book, you need to read it 50 times. I'm not going to require that. But the more you read it, the more you're going to understand it, the more you're going to understand how it all fits together. That is one of the things that's true, is you read through it the first time, but then you read through it the second time, you pick it up the third time and fourth time. So the more you read it, the better off you'll be in learning this and seeing how all of this stuff fits together in every sense of the term. Now, tonight, what we're going to do for the rest of the time is, as I said, going to kind of go over some historical notes, some kind of ideas, also talk about the divisions of the Bible in the Old Testament from the Jewish viewpoint, and then we're going to actually, hopefully, get into that itself. When we start talking about the idea of, hold on just a second. When we start talking about the divisions of the Bible, most of the time we think about the divisions of the English Bible. And in the English Bible, what do we have? Well, you've got the Old Testament is divided into 4 sections. We call it the Law, which would consider to be the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then we call that the Law of Moses, but it's not only just the Law of Moses, it also contains in the first book, Genesis, it contains the idea of, as well, it contains the idea of the patriarchal law, okay? Then, and by the way, this is what we call in the English viewpoint. Now, if you were a Jewish person, as you're looking at the Hebrew Bible, you too would say the first 5 books would be the law. Okay, so everything from Genesis to Deuteronomy is that. Then in the English part, we talk about what we call the history books. And in these books, you would find everything from Joshua all the way through the book of Esther. Now, some of those books are not included there. We're talking about Psalms and so forth like that. This brings us to the third part, which we call poetry. And that concludes everything from Psalms to Song of Solomon. And then we have what we call the prophetic books. And the prophetic books we break into 2 sections. The major prophets, and that would include everybody from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, to Daniel. And then we call it the minor prophets, which contains everything from Hosea through Malachi. Now that's how we divide the Bible into these 4 major sections: law, history, poetry, and prophetic books. In the Jewish way of doing things, they only divided it into 3 sections. They divided it into the law, then they divided it in what they called the prophets. And they included all the history books as well as what we call the prophetic books. And then they had what is called the writings, also called what we call poetry. And that would include everything from Psalms through Song of Solomon. And then also some of the prophetic books that we think would go in there. Also would be in here would be Daniel and a couple of others. So this is where it is. In Luke chapter 24, when Jesus was talking to his disciples, he says, I have come to fulfill everything that is written in the law and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. So that's how they divided their Bible in that respect. And the prophets. Let's talk about that for just a moment. The idea of the prophets is this. The prophets in the Old Testament were mainly spokesmen for God. That's all they were. And when we start thinking about this ideal of prophets, we begin automatically to think of a fellow by the name of Moses. Moses will prophesy the fact in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. He will prophesy of the idea that there's going to come a prophet after me. We find also that Joshua would be considered a prophet, even though we consider him more of a historical figure, leading the children of Israel to take the land of promise, but he becomes the spokesman after Moses dies. You have the prophets such as Elijah and Elisha, okay? And we find as well, as you look at this, then again, they are spokesmen for God. That's the main idea. So they would include not just the prophetic books as we call them, but also the history books as well. As we look especially at Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, what we're going to find happening is you have this historical books which deal with the time of the judges, or actually during the time of Joshua's judges, through 1 Samuel chapter 8. Where God is trying to run things through a theocracy. Now, what is a theocracy?
One in control.
Huh?
One in control.
Right. But specifically, it comes from the word theo, which means God in control. God is the source of the government. Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, what do? They ask for a king so that we might be like everybody around us, interestingly enough. So then it becomes a monarchy. Okay? And now, as we think about this idea, who is in charge? Well, it's not God. God is still in charge. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. But now you actually have a king who is the one that they deal with in civil matters, right? But you also, at the same time, have you not only have the monarchy, but you also have the priestly class that's supposed to be doing what? They're supposed to be taking care of things of God, right? All right, so that's what's going on. Now, what happens through this time of monarchy, from the time of Saul all the way till the time of the carrying away, and we're going to talk about those dates in just a few moments, the Assyrian captivity and then the Babylonian captivity, you have the monarchy, but then after that, the monarchy's gone. There's no more kings that are going to continue to reign until a little bit later on. So then, during this time frame, all up during the time of the monarchy, you have the priests that were supposed to be doing what they needed to be doing, but a lot of them, when you read through the prophets, you'll see that a lot of the condemnation in Jeremiah, in Isaiah, and some of these others are condemning the priests because they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. On the other side, you also have these guys, Elisha, coming in to talk to these kings as well as everybody else and call everybody into account. So mainly much of the work that was being done were what we call, again, the prophets. When we look at the ideal of prophets, again, we know that they were just simply spokesmen of God. Most of the time when we think of prophecy, we think of something predictive, right? You do have that. But when you're reading Isaiah, when you're reading some of these other passages, you realize in no certain terms that there's more to it than that. They are not only, for example, Isaiah will be talking about the Messiah, and he will be talking about the Messiah's reign. But again, what does it boil back down to? Where again, God is going to set up a theocracy. He's then going to be in charge. He's going to have the kingdom of God, and the Messiah is going to be the prince. So you have that idea, but they're also finding that in a lot of this, these prophets are preaching to the people of that day about their specific sin. So a lot of times when people start thinking about this idea of prophecy, they start thinking something way off in the future, predictive prophecy, which you have, but the majority of the books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, of course, when you get into some of them, Ezekiel, Daniel, you have apocalyptic literature where it gets really, really hairy trying to figure out exactly what's going on there and what's he talking about and why he says it that way. I don't have the time in this class to go over every detail about that. There's no way I can begin to do that. But the bottom line is they are preaching to the people of their day. They are preaching to kings. They're holding kings accountable. They're holding priests accountable. They're holding everybody accountable for what is going on. And so this is the reason why the historical books would be included in what we call the prophetic books, because the prophets were mainly spokesmen of the people to the people of that day. And again, if we keep that in mind and we're reading through Isaiah, and especially in this class, as we read through Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, we're going to see that Haggai and Malachi, the message that they're going to bring, are there going to be predictive prophecies in there? Yes. But they're really going to come down hard on the people of that day and what they need to be doing. Let me just go ahead and say this. In the first part of the book of Ezra, we're going to read about the first 6 chapters of the events that brought the children of Israel back into the land of Canaan. And we're going after the captivity. And then we're also going to talk about the problems they ran into when they were starting to reestablish and rebuild the temple. And Haggai is going to specifically talk to the people of that day, Haggai chapter 1, and he's going to fuss at them. You are building these beautiful houses. What are you doing for my house? Okay, and when we get into that, we'll get into the whole idea of the temple and how God felt about the temple, even in the Old Testament, and how we can then talk about it in the temple in the New Testament as well. So this is kind of what's helping us to understand what's going on. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther would fit in with what we call these prophetic books because of that. You do have, as I said earlier, some of the writings. You have Daniel. You have a couple of the others sitting in there, and you're sitting there scratching your head. But mainly it's because of the nature of the book. Daniel, as I said, would have a lot of apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic literature simply means the idea of hidden literature. The word hidden there. And apocalypsis is the Greek word that means revelation. In fact, that's the actual word for the Greek word for the book of Revelation in the New Testament is apocalypsis. And what it is what has been formally revealed is now made known. You have a lot of apocalyptic literature in Daniel. You have a lot of it in Ezekiel. When we get to Ezekiel, where he starts talking about the dimensions of another temple, that really becomes interesting. Is he actually talking about an actual literal temple that's going to be rebuilt on the literal place where the old temple was destroyed? Well, if you start looking at the dimensions and everything like that, there's no way that that could be the case. So premillennialists will go there and say, well, because God or Jesus didn't set up his kingdom to begin with, they didn't get that temple built right. So we got to wait till Jesus comes again, the rapture, the whole 9 yards. And that's, again, part of the reason why I like studying this, because the more we study the Old Testament, the more we're going to understand the New. We're going to understand the background of that. Revelation, the book of Revelation has over 300 different allusions to the Old Testament. So for us to really grasp what he's saying in the book of Revelation, we need to go back and figure out what Daniel's talking about. We need to figure out what Ezekiel's talking about. And I can give you a list of those too, and I will try to do that. I will try to make a list of everything I'm going to send you later on. But it is amazing how much they reference one, and how John will reference Daniel, and how he will reference Ezekiel, and how he will reference some of these places. So again, it's very interesting to me, and I think, again, that's part of the reason why we need to spend a lot more time in the Old Testament. I have been in the church for since I was 13, so you're looking at 42 years. And I can't tell you how many times I've been told by brethren, well, we don't need to study that Old Testament. We're not under it anymore. And all we need to worry about is the New Testament. I firmly believe you will not understand the book of Hebrews if you do not grasp what's going on in the Old Testament. We will not totally understand what John is trying to do in Revelation unless we're willing to spend the time in getting the Old Testament and find out what the references were in those respects. So in every one of these situations, that's what we're trying to do, and that's why I really enjoy teaching the Old Testament courses, because of trying to bring out how all these things fit back together and how they're used in the New Testament. So this is, and again, in a 12 or 13-week course, we just have to cram a lot of stuff in there. So I'm going to give you a ton of information in that respect. But that's how the Bible is broke down from that. Now, when we start talking about this idea, we got to go back before we get into the book of Ezra itself. We have to then start looking at some other things and key in on when we meditate upon this. There's some things we've got to consider as we're looking at Ezra. As I pull up my other notes now, we need to see, as we're starting to look at the book of Ezra, I'm going to give you just a little bit of the history. All right, that's what my plan is, and that's what I'm going to try to do to the best of my ability. The history that brings this up. We go back to the time of the monarchy. Now, God, in the Old Testament, did not want, he was their king, and he expected them to understand he was their king. He did not want them, nor did he desire for them to have another king. 1 Samuel chapter 8, again, the people will come to Samuel. And you've got to remember a little bit of the history that's going on there. In the first part of 1 Samuel, you have a priest that's also serving as a prophet. His name is Eli. Eli, in the first book of 1 Samuel, Eli does not take care of his sons. His sons then begin to, they're actually doing things around the temple that they should not have been doing, or around the tabernacle. Remember, at this time, there's no temple. This is the place of Shiloh. Shiloh was where that was. And Shiloh is a Hebrew word that means peace. It's always interesting to me, here's an aside, that one of the worst battles in the Civil War in America was at a place called Shiloh. and it's interesting that this is a place called peace. So interestingly enough, you had Eli with his sons. His sons were supposed to be taking care of the sacrifices. They were sleeping with the women as they come to sacrifice. They were taking parts of the sacrifice that was not allowed for the priest to do. Eli did not stop his sons, except to the extent of saying, you ought to know better than this. Don't do this. God's going to be angry. But he did nothing else in this matter. As Eli was serving as a judge, he also had the authority to do what he was supposed to do to make sure the law was taken care of. But he didn't do it. If he did, then he should have punished his sons. And immediately, it's easy for us to sit back and say, well, yeah, that's what I would have done. I don't know about that. You've got that heart part in there, you know. But he obviously loved his sons more than God. So as a result of that, he did not do what was supposed to be done. So it was going to be taken away from him. Then it goes to Samuel. Samuel makes the same mistake. His sons are not like him. He was one of the most honest men that there ever was. In fact, whenever he comes and coronates Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 12, you see that he will ask the children of Israel, if I've done anything or taken anything away, let us know right now. In other words, he's stepping back out of the picture so Saul can now be the king over Israel like he's supposed to be. And of course, the people said, no, you've been honest and upright all up to this point in time. And the point that Samuel then will make is, okay, you've asked for this so that you could have a king so that you could be like the nations around you. Here's what's going to happen because you have a king. And by the way, that's a whole nother study. Read 1 Samuel chapter 8, but especially 1 Samuel chapter 12. He gets very specific as to what's going to happen to the Jews because they asked for a king. And he starts talking about in detail what government does when we set up a government. He said they're going to take your best fields. They're going to take your best sons and put them in the army. They're going to take your maidservants and your daughters and have them to be as cooks. In other words, as you read through 1 Samuel 12, the main theme as I read through that is take, 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 take. History has not changed. Government still takes, 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 take. And it's so interesting, and I'm convinced from what I've studied about the American founding fathers, they realized this, and that's part of the reason why they said, look, we've got to put a limit on government in some way or another, or it's going to be take, 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 and take. Think about the idea that every time a government, whether a city government, a county government, a state government, a federal government, every time a law is made, every time an enactment goes on, there is less freedom. So it's interesting as you read God talking about what government was going to do. That's exactly what government did and continues to do up to this point in time. And he emphasizes that as he goes through it. Well, we have the reign of Saul. Saul wasn't a good king. That's what it winds up in the last part of 1 Samuel. He dies in battle. David takes over. David was a good king, but David also, possibly because of the authority that he had, he starts sitting back and saying, well, the law doesn't really apply to me. And he commits the sin with Bathsheba. He has a son by the name of Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man on earth at that time. 1 Kings chapter 3, God asked, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Talk about a blank check. Wow. And he asked for wisdom, and here was a young man, probably 18, 19 years old, beginning to do this. He said, I've got to know how to do with this. But at the very end, with his 700 wives and 300 concubines, they lead his heart away. 1 Samuel chapter 11 talks about the events where God is going to divide the kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 12 comes in where Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, and Jeroboam come in together. And read 1 Samuel chapter 13 where Jeroboam, after he takes over the 10 northern tribes, the first thing he does is change worship. And specifically 1 Kings and also the book of 1 Chronicles that emphasizes this, said he did these things as he made them up in his own heart. He changed the priesthood from the Levitical priests. He changed the place of worship from Jerusalem to Dan and Bethel. He changed the, I just went blank, I'm sorry. But he also changed the feast from the 7th month to the 8th month. In other words, he was doing things that he wanted to do. And anyway, this sets up the 10 northern tribes, the Israel. Now, after this point, from here on out, you have the two divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And I will send you again. I've got a list of kings, and you can see the kings. Israel had 4 separate dynasties, which meant that you had a different king come on there, and then he would have a couple of his sons, but then his whole family would be wiped out. So they'd have to set up a different dynasty. Under Judah, there's only one dynasty. And the dynasty here is specifically the descendants of David. And again, part of the reason for that was, again, a promise made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that you shall still have someone sitting on your throne. Now, we know, and we apply that in 2 Samuel chapter 7 to Jesus, as it should fit. But during the time of Judah, you have nothing but descendants of David and the Davidic there. There was no good king in Israel. Absolutely none. You would find them going either after Baal, as in the case of Ahab and Jezebel. It's interesting that the Bible spends a lot of time talking about these two. A lot of times, some of these kings in the Israelite dynasty, they lasted every bit of 3 days. Then they were assassinated. Okay, so you'd think about that whole thing as it plays out, but you have Ahab and Jezebel, who would go after the god Baal. You have most of them, it talks about a lot of these kings following after the gods of Jeroboam, which he set up, those golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Okay? It's interesting as well that when you have these periods of really, really things are getting dark, that's where God sends specific prophets. Elijah comes on the scene during the days of Ahab and Jezebel. And this is recorded about in 1 Kings chapter 16 or 1 Kings chapter 17 and going through the end of the book all the way into 2 Kings, where Elijah then places the mantle on Elisha. And so it's also interesting as you look at that, these guys are coming in to try to counteract the sin and the depredation and the degradation of the children of Israel up to that point in time. God sends these prophets. The priests start doing their job. They obviously, the 10 northern tribes, they're not doing their job because the Levitical priesthood is out. Not only do you have Judah, but Judah includes Judah, Benjamin, and from what we read in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 12 and 13, you have most of the Levitical Levites coming back to Jerusalem here so that they could worship God. Judah lasts about 132 years longer than Israel. Israel is taken into captivity in 722 BC. 722 to 721 BC, okay, by Assyria. It says Y-R-I, Assyria. Okay? And again, this was something that had been prophesied about. Now, Assyria, and again, I will show you all of this later, but Assyria was one of those very important kings or things. And in fact, in the historical notes that I will send you a little bit later on, Assyria is where we really start off. Assyria was a very wicked group of people. Their capital was Nineveh. It was Nineveh. Now, what's important about this is you're going to have two prophets that's going to talk about Nineveh and its destruction. One of them was Jonah. We remember that in the whole story of Jonah. And he went to Nineveh and was told by God to go to Nineveh. And this was the only preacher that we ever read about in all of Scripture that was upset because his sermon was a success. And that was amazing. And that's always been kind of amazing to me because of his attitude and his hard heart. The other prophet was a guy by the name of Nahum. And Nahum actually tells about the destruction of Nineveh. Nineveh falls, excuse me just a minute. Nineveh falls in, well, let me just go ahead and get this time frame out, all right? So in 722, you have the fall of Israel. And it's also good, if you're studying the Old Testament, to kind of keep these things in mind. What was the capital of Israel? It was Samaria. So sometimes, as you're reading through the prophets, he will not call it Israel, he will talk about Samaria, because that was the seat of government. All right? Whenever you talk about Judah, a lot of times, rather than call it Judah, he would refer to what? Jerusalem. Because again, that was the seat of government. Damascus was the capital of Syria, which, by the way, is still the capital of Syria. So if you're reading through the scriptures and it talks about the fall of Damascus, then you can automatically think he's talking about Syria. Syria is not the same as Assyria. Okay? That's what makes history so fun, isn't it? You get halfway figured out there, and then oh, okay, well, we're talking about two totally different countries here. Thank you. We appreciate that. Nineveh was the capital there. Babylon was the capital of Babylon. So as you go through this, you'll see a lot of this references to Samaria or to Babylon or to Nineveh or to Jerusalem. And again, Damascus. Tyre and Sidon were very important cities at that time. So just kind of give you an idea of what's going on. That's how it plays out. In 626 BC, and I will send this to you, but it's good probably to sit down and write it again. 626 BC, a fellow by the name of Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar rebels against Assyria. Okay? And what they're trying to do, the Assyrians had taken over Babylon. You have, again, history, if we had the time to go through that, you had the old Babylonian Empire, then you had the Neo-Babylonian Empire, where Babylon at one time was a very strong nation, but then fell. Assyria took it over. Other nations had taken it over. Now we're coming back to what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this was... you have a lot of different kings that's bringing this about. Nabopolassar was the father of a fellow by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Nabopolassar rebels against Assyria in 626. 14 years later, Nineveh falls in 612. In 612 was the fall of Nineveh. Now, let me just say this. And again, all I'm doing here is just trying to give us a background of what's going on. The Assyrians were very rough people. They were just cruel beyond belief. It was the Assyrians who, when they conquered a people, they would impale the captives on a stake. In other words, they would sharpen a stake and then they'd put you on it. And they got it figured out in such a way, if you could just imagine this, to where you could literally be in torment or suffer there. They work it out in such a way to where you last 2 or 3 hours on that stake. What's interesting about this is where the idea of crucifixion comes in. It starts off with the Assyrians and their wicked, how wicked and how evil they become. The Babylonians increase on it. By the time of the Romans, whenever you actually have crucifixion, which was the main way that they killed thieves, robbers, wicked people. When you have that kind of situation, there were actually stories where you could read that somebody could last on a cross something like 6 or 7 or 8 days, if you can imagine that. So it's interesting in that respect. Just little asides here. Nabopolassar takes over 622 BC or 626 BC. Nabopolassar rebels against Assyria at 612. Nineveh falls. Now, after that, as I said, Nabopolassar was the one that started it. There was a fellow by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar becomes the major guy here. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar has his reign for a period of about 40, 45 years. He was the guy that created the Hanging Garden of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He's the guy that Daniel is talking to in the middle of the book of Daniel. Daniel was brought back. But it's Nebuchadnezzar that actually brings the children of Israel into captivity, or specifically the children of Judah. Because in 722, the 10 northern tribes are out of the picture. So all that's left now is Judah. Okay? So we actually have, and this is where it's really important to start really paying attention now. Not that you haven't been already, I know you have. But you have 3 different dates where Nebuchadnezzar comes in and starts to take the city of Jerusalem. 606 to 605 BC, where that's the first, what we call the first carrying away. The king was Jehoiakim. And this is where Daniel +3. And what's the +3? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's where that comes in. They were taken away. And now you've got to realize that this kind of gives us the date of what? This gives us the date of the first chapter of Daniel. Okay, so that tells us what's going on there. All right. Now, in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes back and takes another group away. Here, Jehoiakim. Now, you're thinking, well, I can't keep up with that. Well, let me understand something. If you're reading this in the Hebrew, it's the exact same name. The translators try to yell us there's two different guys by writing these different words. They're trying to tell us these are two different guys. Okay? And what happens is Jehoiakim, take one now, you have Jehoiakim. He only had reigned 3 months before he was taken away. And the Bible will say in the book of Jeremiah that he's not going to have any children to sit on the throne. Okay? Now, also in this second carrying away, we have a fellow by the name of Ezekiel. He is taken to Babylon, where he preaches by the river Kibar. Okay? So that just kind of helps us to see that. And then finally, in 586 BC, he comes back the second time, or the last time, and Jerusalem falls. He's had it with this Jerusalem. Zedekiah had tried to go to the Egyptians and try to get some help. They tried to make leagues and alliances with other nations. Again, Jeremiah, again, some of the minor prophets will come on there and say, look, you're making, rather than trusting me, you're making all these alliances. And he said, I'm not only going to destroy you, I'm going to destroy the people that you're trying to make alliances with. Nebuchadnezzar will actually go all the way down into Egypt. He will take over the Egyptians. He will bring all of their gods, all the Egyptian gods, back to Babylon with him, and just totally decimate Egypt during this time frame.
So the first 2 times he came in, he was going to allow them to continue with their rule of religion and everything as long as they followed his governmental regulations.
As long as they followed. And mainly, again, it was more the idea of you got to pay me tribute. Yeah. I am the over king, and you got to pay me tribute. Jehoiakim reigned, and then he finally died. So Jehoiakim comes on. He reigns for 3 months. But what happens during this time frame? This was one of the kings of Judah that was one of the most wicked. And what he does is he takes the money and his needs to pay the tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. He takes that from the rich. I want you to just key in on this. He takes the money to pay the taxes from the rich. Interestingly enough, how history repeats itself, but he also engages in a building program in Jerusalem. When we're talking about the tribute that Nebuchadnezzar put on them was crushing. But he's going to start a building program all through here. So now you've got the poor people that are just taking everything they've got to live. They're also having to take money to help him build all this stuff. He is the kind of king, he will get the poor people to build for him, but he's not going to pay them anything. So they got to get out after the end of every day and try to scrounge up what they can. And this guy is the same guy that also cut up the prophecy of Jeremiah and burned it in the fire. So you have what's going on here. So you see, it just brings down what's happening. Zedekiah is the last king. And as you read the last part of the book of Jeremiah, in the last few chapters, right before the destruction, he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem in Jeremiah 39 and then again in Jeremiah 52. And Zedekiah, all up to this time, continually comes and asks Jeremiah, what is the word of the Lord? And Jeremiah will constantly say, surrender. Don't continue this thing. You will save your lives. Have everybody surrender. But Zedekiah never had enough backbone to do what Jeremiah said because he was influenced by all of the people, his counselors, and he kept the war going until in 586, Nebuchadnezzar just destroyed the place.
A lot of those kings listened to bad counsel.
Yes, they did. And interestingly enough,
history is
it's so interesting in that respect. The Greek ideal of history is that, and we understand that the Greek ideal of history is that history will always repeat itself, that history goes in cycles. And there is truth to that, okay? But the Hebrew view of history and the view that we have, is yes, you have these cycles where it just seems like governments make the same mistakes, do the same things over and over and over again. But the Hebrew idea is, and the Christian idea is, yes, there may be history where it does seem like it goes in cycles, but there is going to be an end, and it's linear. It's more of a linear idea of history. So they knew that everything was working out toward the final purpose of what God wants to work out. But the Greeks kept thinking, well, it's just cycles after cycles after cycles. So you see kind of both of the same ideas as we look through history in that respect. Now, in 586, this was the fall of Jerusalem. Now, Jeremiah had in Jeremiah chapter 25, and as I said earlier, chapter 29, verse 11, prophesied the fact that there was going to be 70 years captivity. All right? Now, the question always pops up to be, and this is interesting as you look at this, when did the 70-year time frame start? Most commentators believe that it started in this area here. So if you get down to the 70 years, you're going to come down here to 536, 535 BC. And this is where, roughly, where it talks about Zerubbabel King Cyrus of the Persians, allowing the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. So from 606, 605 to 536, that's about 70 years, isn't it? Well, it is 70 years, right? And most of them count it from here. Some commentators, you see, and I'm just going to give you this idea, some of them start the thing right here when it talks about the final total destruction, and it goes down to 516 BC. Now, the thing I want to show you in this is that this could fit both ways. But one of the passages in Jeremiah specifically says this is where it started. This is where the prophecy of the 70 years after that first carrying away actually took place. He said there's going to be 70 years. So this is the one I'm holding to, though for a long time I held to the other. From this time frame to this time frame, the sacrifices started again. Sacrifices started again in the temple. And so that's the reason why some people think it's from 586 to 516, because you had the last sacrifice in the temple when the city was destroyed, and it didn't start again until 516. See? So it's interesting how these things play out as you look at it all. In 537 BC, now try to again keep in mind what's going on. You now have a whole nother shift in the world, okay? The Assyrians have been destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed them. He took the children of Israel into captivity, took Judah into captivity again. The Assyrians had taken the 10 northern tribes. Now you have another kingdom on the thing. And what is that kingdom? Anybody?
These are the kingdoms that start finding Daniel, right?
Yeah.
Babylon. It's not the Medo-Persians, is it?
Yep, that's it. Okay. Good. So again, so look at the idea of how Daniel had prophesied. During the days of Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, but after you shall come another kingdom, and then there's going to be 2 other kingdoms. So now you have, after the head of gold, you have what? You have the Medo-Persian Empire. And mainly it becomes known as the Persian Empire. The Medes and the Persians had worked together to bring about the fall of Babylon. But Cyrus was the king of Persia, and he's the guy that really, and so in 537, after he gained control, so Babylon fell about the year 538. So about 537, Cyrus prophesied about in Isaiah 44 and 45, by name, Isaiah prophesied of a fellow by the name of Cyrus that's going to be my servant. Now, when did Isaiah write his book? Roughly 750 to 700 BC. He probably prophesied about 50 years. So now we're at 537. Here you have the very name of the guy that he prophesied about back in 750. So you're talking 120 years before the event, mentioning him by name, which again is another element of the predictive prophecy. That's why, and I don't get into this a whole lot of detail, but you have a lot of people in a lot of these colleges that try to attack the veracity and the validity of the Bible, and they will say that Isaiah could not have been written as early as 750 to 700 BC because they deny that there's any predictive prophecies in the book. But what's happening here, we know roughly the time frame of 750 to 700 because he tells us in Isaiah 1 and 2 exactly what kings he's talking about or prophesied about during that time frame. So that's where we get the date. When they say, well, no, Isaiah couldn't have done it because there is no such thing as miracles, there is no such thing as supernatural, therefore Isaiah could not have done that. And they would even go so far as to say, because there is no predictive prophecy, parts of Isaiah wasn't written until about maybe 100 BC. Okay? The tragedy of that is whenever they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they found an entire copy. It's a copper scroll. They found an entire copy of the book of Isaiah. They dated it to at least 250, 300 BC. And it was an entire copy of the entire book. Well, that does away with their whole argument that it couldn't have been written until about 100 BC. You see. So it's interesting how that works out. Now, he mentions him specifically by name. When you start talking about the idea of prophecy, you have to realize that prophets are going to be very specific. They're not going to talk in vague generalities. I could talk about the fact that probably tomorrow there's going to be some people, maybe by the name of Mary, that's going to walk through Town Center Mall. What are the chances of that happening? Pretty good. If you've got different people that's going to walk through Town Center Mall, I can make that prophecy, but that's not really predictive. If I say at 9 o'clock in the morning, well, the mall opens at 10, there's a let's put it this way. Let's say at 10:01 a.m., there's a lady by the name of Mary Benson that's going to walk into the mall and go to such and such store at this time. Now, that's predictive prophecy. Read through a lot of these so-called prophets today, and they are so general that it could fit anything. I think as you read through, and again, the History Channel does a lot of this when they talk about the prophecies of Nostradamus. Well, you can make any of that fit. They will deny that there is such a thing as predictive prophecy in the Bible, but then they will turn right around and say Nostradamus was one of these great prophets. Okay, you can't have it both ways, guys. You're either going to say that if Nostradamus was able to predict these things in this respect, then what? Isaiah has that same chance. Jeremiah has that same chance. You've got to be consistent in this thing. And there are some that try to be consistent, but it's extremely interesting. So what have they come up with? Well, rather than admitting to the fact that we are answerable to God, so the History Channel now has a bunch of shows about ancient aliens, and we got here by the aliens. So that's on the side. I shouldn't even go on now, but you see what I'm saying? It's always amazing to me how they're not willing to say what God is willing to do, but you see they go this other route. And that's what's so sad about it. In 521, all right, 537, you have the first return of the Jews. Now, remember, they were taken away in three different ways, three different deportations. You have the first return under Zerubbabel. Okay? And there was about 41,000 people that came back. A little bit over that. We'll talk about that in detail. All right. So you have the first return under Zerubbabel, and here is where the foundation was laid. The temple foundation was laid, and they were going to rebuild the temple, but they ran into some problems. So this is the first return, right around 537, 536. Now, we go a little bit later on in 521, which is 16 years later. Haggai and Zechariah preach. Haggai and Zechariah preach. And what their job is to stir the people up and build that temple. So that's what he's going to emphasize. For 16 years, the foundation was laid, but they did not build it. And Ezra tells us the reason why. Now we're actually getting into my class, right? All right. Now, in 457 BC, 457, Ezra now comes from Babylon, Babylon, Persia, and he comes to restore the law. So you had first off, in the first return, the idea was trying to restore the temple worship. Restore the temple worship. In the second return, under Persia, he's trying to restore the law. Even though they had been doing what God wanted them to do, and they had rebuilt or strived to rebuild the temple, they still weren't doing what God wanted them to do in other ways. One of the things that got them in trouble to begin with was the fact that God had told them in the book of Deuteronomy, do not intermarry with the people. They're going to lead your heart away. They did, and their heart was led away. That's part of the reason why they wound up into captivity. When Ezra comes back on the scene, he's going to find a bunch of people, many of them leaders, that have again intermarried with the women of the land. And so he's going to restore the law. Then in 445, Nehemiah comes on the scene. And his job was to restore the city. All during this time, there had not been any city walls. Now, again, the way they would protect their cities at that time, they would build walls around the cities. All up to this point in time, they restored the temple in 521 or 537. And all this during this time frame, there was no walls around the cities. It was still a dump from where Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the place. And now Nehemiah comes on the scene and he restores the city walls, built the city walls in 52 days with everybody's help. Nehemiah, as we go through it, I'll try to probably spend one class on it at least, but Nehemiah is a great book on leadership and how we become leaders, how he got the people motivated and everything like that. So that's what we're going to try to do. In 433, he leaves Jerusalem. 433, he leaves Jerusalem and goes back to Persia. And then in 428, he returns, and this is the events of Nehemiah chapter 13. Now, also included 428. Now, I have not covered the book of Esther. Esther, in Ezra chapters 1 through 6, you have the actual history of the rebuilding of the temple. In Ezra chapter 7, and going through the rest of the book, in Ezra chapter 7, this is where Ezra comes back. Between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7, there's about, according to different guys, anywhere from a 40 to 60 year time frame between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. This is where Esther comes in. This is where we're going to study the book of Esther very quickly about this. And again, what's very interesting about this is as we go into the book of Esther, and I'm not going to do it today because, again, there's just so much to cover. But make a long story short, in that 40 to 60 year time frame, the Persian king, who we know as Ahasuerus, and I'm not even sure if that's how you spell his name. Okay. You see what I'm trying to say? Look in the book of Esther, you'll find it. Okay. But what we have in the book of Esther is Esther chapter 1 opens up where he's having this huge party that lasts for half a year. Ahasuerus, by the way, other name was Xerxes. Xerxes the first. And without going into a lot of detail right now, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes' daddy, was named Darius. Darius had started the wars with the Greeks. He had started the war with the Greeks and had been defeated by the Greeks. Now, the Greeks, well, interestingly enough, they ran by city-states. Every city was a state in and of itself. But they couldn't, whenever Darius comes and tries to attack, they consolidate. So actually, Darius is defeated. He comes back, says, I'm going to get my armies up. We're going to go back. We're going to finish Greece off. He dies. Xerxes comes on the scene. And you probably remember just recently, in the last 10 years, the movie The 300. That's the Spartan soldiers that are fighting against the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae. You have the Athenian Navy destroying Persian forces in a naval battle. Interestingly enough, Athens was mainly a naval. Sparta was mainly the army. Okay, so interestingly enough, Xerxes is so arrogant. He's so proud. As you read about him in Esther chapter 1, because his wife, he demanded that his wife come and appear before all of these drunken guests. She refused to do it. Her name was Vashti. Jewish literature actually says that she was pregnant with her first child and he wanted her to come before them naked. And she said, I ain't doing it. So he deposed her, and that sets up this whole situation that plays out with Esther. But in the meantime, while all this happens, Xerxes gets himself beat by the Greeks, which again sets up what happens with Philip of Macedon and then Alexander the Great. So you see how all this begins to happen. Xerxes is a guy that's even though he's very strong, very arrogant. Again, read through the history. You actually read that he was building a bridge to transport some of his army across the Hellespont. And a storm come up and totally wiped the bridge out. It's kind of like a pontoon bridge, as we want to understand. Wiped the bridge out, so he commanded. I'm not making this up, but he commanded that his officers lash the sea 30 stripes for destroying his bridge. I'm not making this stuff up. And I know when people sit there, they, no, yeah, it's in history.
Arrogance run amok.
Arrogance beyond run amok. So there we have, and the reason I'm telling you all this, it kind of tells us the kind of guy he was, which would cause Vashti to be out of the picture, which caused Esther to come into the picture, and literally save the Jews. Hitler was not the first guy trying to annihilate the Jews. And so it's interesting as you play and look at every one of these things and how they all play out, how that history plays out, and everything along that line. After this, again, Persia retreats to never bother Greece again. And I will send all of this. I'll get you all the way down to the Roman Empire. And again, I will also send you the kings of Israel and everything like that. I don't mind. It's something that I've been working on and continue to work on for years. So that kind of gives you some of the historical background of what we're talking about. All right. So this kind of helps us to understand where Ezra comes in the scene. But we also going to find out here's where Haggai and Zechariah. So they're going to be talking during the same time frame as they're rebuilding the temple. Ezra comes on the scene. You have Nehemiah. Malachi is going to be the last book written, 400 BC. The last thing that Malachi is going to talk about is the coming of John and Mercer. And then the New Testament opens. And then you go with that intertestamental period where we get the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the synagogues and all that other stuff, which you don't read any of it in the Old Testament, and all of a sudden it's there in the New Testament. So that's where the intertestamental period is. Let's take about a 5-minute break.
Good stuff. So some of this I've already taken. I took Daniel.
Did you?
With Lee.
Uh-huh.
So some of this
is beginning.
It's in the back of my mind.
Yeah, it's beginning to click, and that's the reason. Once you get the big picture, and then you start seeing this other stuff, then everything starts really to click.
It is amazing when it starts to connect how much easier it is to put all this together.
Mm-hmm.
So And you're right. You talk about the Old Testament in Hebrews. I mean, every chapter in Hebrews quotes from the Old Testament.
That's right.
Everyone.
You've got to know
And
that.
the shadows and the types.
Mm-hmm.
You can't not.
I'll be right back.
You talk about predictive prophecy. I just don't understand how folks can deny that with the evidence that's there. I was just watching today one of Kyle Butt's videos that he does on that. And
I don't either. And it's amazing to me as well. But yeah. All right. Now we're getting into the book of Ezra itself. All right. And as I said, I will get this all to you. So I know you copied a lot of it down, but if you have these dates and everything, I like these things, but they just don't seem to keep it clean that long. And I use that dry erase marker and it made the whole thing work. So go figure. All right, no, I guess I'll be writing down a whole lot until I get this stuff figured out a little bit. All right, now into the book of Ezra itself. Let's talk about Ezra for a few minutes. All right. The word Ezra in the Old Testament means help. And he helped his people in many, many ways. As you think about it, he was the first of all a priest. He could trace his lineage all the way back to Aaron, Ezra chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. So we know he was a priest, and we know that as a priest, he was a mediator, therefore, between God and man. Okay? And what's interesting about this is that it's Ezra, according to the Jewish tradition, that really is lauded and glorified for the work that he did in trying to bring about the people and what they were doing. According to Jewish tradition, if God had not given the law to Moses, he would have given it to Ezra. Ezra's love for the law. In Ezra chapter 7, verse 10, it says that Ezra sought the law of the Lord to do it and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments. And if you compare that with Acts chapter 1 at verse 1, where it talks about Jesus began to do and to teach. So the idea is you see Ezra, much like Jesus, where he kept the law. He understood the law, he kept the law, and then he started teaching the law. It has always been interesting to me that that's what, as preachers, as youth ministers, as whatever service that we have to make sure that we're doing it first. In Acts chapter 20, verse 28, Paul will tell the elders, take heed to yourselves. Why does he say take heed to themselves first? Because if they don't take care of themselves, they're not going to be able to take care of the flock. So you've got to make sure of your spiritual behavior. You've got to make sure of where you stand with God. You've got to make sure that everything you're doing is where it needs to be before you can ever try to lead somebody else to do it. So Ezra sought the law of the Lord to do it, and then to teach in Israel statutes and judgment. One of the traditions the Jews has is that he probably assembled most of the books of the Old Testament. When you look at the book of Ezra chapter, let's just look at that. Look at Ezra chapter 1 at verse 1. Now, in my Bible, this is pretty close to one another. Okay, in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, he talks about the fall of Jerusalem, and in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 22. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing, saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May the Lord his God be with him and let him go up." And if you notice there in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, again, you have a little bit more of an elucidation, but it's pretty well word for word what we just read in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. So again, a lot of people do see that idea that he was the one that probably put a lot of this together. And he may have been the one that actually took all the records that they had and, finished up the book of 2 Chronicles. The book of Chronicles and Kings, the book of Kings, as you look through that books and see how it plays out, 1st and 2nd Kings deals with all of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, as well as Judah. The book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles only deals specifically with Judah. And according to most scholars, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were mainly written by priests to talk about specifically the temple and how the king's actions affected worship to God. So you will find more details in the book of 2nd Chronicles concerning Jeroboam's decision. Concerning Jeroboam's decision dealing with how he changed the worship, as we read about in 1 Kings chapter 13. Only he gives a little bit, again, the guy who writes the Chronicles goes a little bit more in detail about it. It's possible as well that Jeremiah had his hand in writing some of the Kings, the book of Kings, as well as possibly some of the Chronicles. Ezra, therefore, would take all these writings together and kind of bring it together. You've also got to realize that the Hebrew tongue, anytime you change, language changes. English, part of the reason why, and again, I think it's a sad tragedy that our schools nowadays do not demand that our kids read William Shakespeare. But William Shakespeare was writing about the same time frame that the King James Version of the Bible was translated. And so we now have gotten to the point, think about how language has changed drastically in that 400-year time frame. When you take all of the Hebrew language and all of the Hebrew books of the Hebrews, for example, if Moses, and I believe he did, wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, he would write in a Hebrew dialect, but it was Ezra, according to the Jewish tradition, that was able to keep the language pretty well the same all the way from the time of Genesis all the way to the time of Ezra as you come to the very end of the Old Testament. So while you have the changes that we see so clearly in English, where the these and the thous and the yous and so forth like that being used 400 years ago, that's not, in the great grand scheme of things, that's not a very long time frame. And you see the thousands of years that the Hebrew language did not change that much. Again, some people have the idea that Ezra is the guy that really was responsible for that. So he would teach the Hebrew language to the people. One of the things that Nehemiah is going to be condemning is the fact in Numbers chapter 13, or Nehemiah chapter 13, is he's going to condemn the fact that some of the people at that time were not speaking the language of the Hebrews. And that language it would have changed just a little bit. You would still have a lot of the Hebrew idioms and everything like that. By the time of the New Testament, the main language in that area would be called Aramaic. Well, again, this was the language that Ezra was writing in. Much of Ezra is written in the Aramaic language. But again, it's just a short offshoot from the Hebrew language. And it's very possible that that's part of the reason why that happened. Another tradition that the Jews say is that it is Ezra that set up the Sanhedrin Council. That he set up the 70 who governed Israel as late as the Jews' time. So whenever we don't read it in the Old Testament, but now all of a sudden we see Jesus brought before the Sanhedrin. And not only Jesus, but also Paul. And some of these others brought before the Sanhedrin Council. Well, where did that come from? Most of the scholars believe that it was Ezra that set it up. And again, the purpose for this was to help them to keep the law, to keep on teaching the law. So he set up the Sanhedrin, according to, again, Jewish history, in an effort to emphasize the enforcement of the law. So then you have that whole system going on and during the time of the Romans, and now we understand where they had and their ideal of authority. The Jews thought the Sanhedrin was the ultimate authority. Of course, the Romans were in charge, and the Romans felt like, no, we're the ultimate ones in authority, and this is where the Jews and the Romans kept having their conflicts, because the Jews were upset because they had a different group of people ruling over them. Deuteronomy chapter 17, God had specifically told Moses, he said, you only choose a guy to be your king from among your own people. Well, the Romans were not from among the Jewish people. So a lot of the Jews during Jesus' time did not profess allegiance to Rome. So you have the group called the Herodians, who were more in line with the Roman government. You had the group of the Zealots, who, according to history, literally were assassins. And it's interesting that Simon, according to the King James Version, one of Jesus' disciples was Simon the Zealot. And these were guys that would carry daggers. And if they see a Roman soldier around and nobody else was around him, he'd come up behind him, stab him, and walk on. That's their idea was what? A total revolution. And in fact, that probably instigated a lot of the things that happened in 64 AD whenever the Jews did try to rebel against Rome and final destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So you see, those were the ones that was emphasizing that. We also probably, according to this, many of the people believe that Ezra was the one that set up the synagogues. He knew that they were in a strange land and that the people, the Jewish children, needed to be taught their ways, their traditions, their history. And that's always interesting to me as you go through the Old Testament, how many times God will always emphasize to the people the importance of their history. Over and over and over and over and over again, up to the time of Jeremiah, he will constantly remind his people of Israel, I am the God that delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians. When we come to Jeremiah, the thing shifts a little bit. Jeremiah is now going to be telling them, you will no longer say, God is the God who delivered you from the Egyptians. But now you will say that God is the God that scattered you throughout the world and brought you back to be my people. Now, why did God want that? Well, again, specifically because we were going to read in Malachi, he wanted a godly seed. That's why Malachi comes down hard on the Jews, because they're divorcing their wives. He said, God does not want you to divorce your wife because God wants a godly seed. Well, what was the purpose of the godly seed? To bring Christ into the world. That was what it was all about. And that's why God would condemn their divorce. So again, the whole discussion of marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Matthew 19 with the Jews, where Jesus goes back to the very beginning of time, this was something that Malachi was having to deal with in 400 BC. So things haven't really changed a whole lot, but they're still trying to emphasize that law. According to, again, the Jewish history, he supposedly set up the synagogues as a means whereby the people could come and teach their children their traditions, their laws, their histories. And so this was what the purpose of it was behind it. Now, a lot of times, and I agree, in one of the commentaries I was reading, a lot of times we take our ideas of church, and we'll think about it in a denominational sense. Many denominations say that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, right? Under the Old Testament law, God did not demand that the children of Israel gather together on the Sabbath day and worship him. He gave the feasts. He gave the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Feast of Pentecost. That's when they were to gather together and praise God. And that's, again, a whole other study, but another study they could spend a lot of time on. Most of those feasts were very celebratory. So think about this idea of the Feast of the Passover. They would celebrate the fact that they had been delivered from Egyptian bondage. It was in that context, in that celebration of the Passover feast, that Jesus would set up his Lord's Supper, right? And sometimes today, and I've read and thought a lot about it, this is my opinion, and I'm not binding it upon anybody, but sometimes today we have made the Lord's Supper not a celebration as much as kind of a somber funeral service. And where we're supposed to remember Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. But the important thing is to remind us that because Jesus died, was buried, and was raised, we can celebrate we have salvation. And again, I think sometimes we make it such a somber funeral event. Where's the celebration to it? How can Jesus talk about setting up the Lord's Supper, which was a very celebratory feast, and then make it into a somber thing? I think there's that ideal of celebration needs to go on as well. And I've been trying to emphasize that a lot more to South Cobb. Yes, we need to think about what Jesus did, but we also need to celebrate. Because of what he did, we have salvation. Because of what he did, we have that. Now, I'm getting off track a little bit, and this is what I often do, so please forgive me. But the bottom line is, the Sabbath day was not set up for a day to worship. They were not to really get out of their tents. That was a day of reflection, a day of rest, and a day where they could stop doing everything else they were doing and meditate upon God. So when you talk about the whole idea of the synagogues was a time when they were gathered together. They would do it on the Sabbath day. That's when they would gather together. And what would they do? Well, in the synagogue worship, they would reread the law. I did not know this until about, I want to say about 10 years ago. I was with my children, one of my children, on a field trip. And they had gone down to a synagogue in downtown Atlanta. And I was fascinated by that because in this particular synagogue, it was also kind of a memorial to the Holocaust. But I also found out some things I never knew. If you are a member of the synagogue here in Atlanta, and you're a member in good standing, and you have to travel, say, to Europe, and you're going to be gone that Saturday, you can go into that synagogue in Europe, wherever you are, and you pick right back up from where you left off in Atlanta the week before. They're reading through the Old Testament in such a structured way that every year you read through the entire Old Testament every Sabbath day. In other words, you leave off at this place. If you're in Europe, you pick right back up where you left off. Then you get back over here to Atlanta, you pick right back up where you left off over there in Europe. You're actually reading through the entire Old Testament in a period of a year in the synagogue. And again, what was the purpose? Reminding the children of Israel, the Jews, of their history, reminding them who they are. Now, I think a lot about the idea, again, with the Lord's church. Should we not be doing the same thing? Yes, we need to be emphasizing we've got to emphasize the Bible, and that's what we need to be doing, is emphasizing the Bible constantly. But again, we need to remind ourselves, how did we get here? How did we as the church get here? We understand Jesus died for the church. We understand that there were men that got back to the Bible. And that's what we need to be emphasizing. A lot of our young people, we don't tell them this. We don't tell them their history. They go out, they get into colleges. And what winds up happening? They're eat up. I mean, literally. We've not given them enough to fight with. That's what the synagogue was. The purpose of the synagogue was to bring up that next group of children to where they're going to remain faithful no matter what the world did to them. And it said a lot in that respect concerning what that idea. And Ezra is the one that supposedly was the guy that got that started. Ezra is also associated with this ideal of going back to the Bible, the beginning of the Pharisees and the scribes. The word Pharisees comes from a Hebrew word parash, which means separate. And that's what, in essence, he did. You might say the Pharisees of Jesus' day were the back to the Bible conservatives. Okay, they were very conservative. And nowadays, it's a what is it? It's a term of disparaging term to call anybody a Pharisee. One thing you have to say about the Pharisees is this: they believed the Bible and they tried their best to obey it. The thing that the Pharisees did that was wrong was trying to add all of their traditions to it in an effort to keep you from breaking the law. And that's what Jesus condemned. He did not ever condemn them for their keeping the law. Never, ever. He never would have done that because he kept the law perfectly. He condemned them because they were making it so much harder for everybody to follow God. That part of the Phariseeism needs to be condemned. Now, as I emphasize that, we do the same thing in the Lord's church. You know, we get into these huge discussions as to what, let's think about some of the things we get into discussions about. What can you do and what can't you do in a church building? Well, we don't even read about a church building in the New Testament. So why are we even having this discussion? We get into these discussions about order of worship. And you know what I'm talking about. It's at the place I preach, there's some ladies there that really believe that we sin because we put the Lord's Supper at the very end of the service. That needs to be in the center of the service. Okay, stop. Where does it say that in the Bible? Well, that's the most important part. Therefore, it needs to be in the center. And I said, well, you could think about the idea that if it is the most important part, we've done everything else of worship. Now we've gotten our hearts really ready to partake of the Lord's Supper.
Preaching the word is supposed to impact
help
your
you.
heart.
Yeah. So you see, in that respect, and they just kind of like, well, it's supposed to be in the center. Okay. Now we're going from the ideal of biblical to the ideal of Phariseeism. We're binding our traditions and our opinions rather than looking strictly at what the Bible has to say about it. It doesn't say what way you do it. You could look at some of the various ideas in the 1st and 2nd century after the beginning of the church and how they did church back then. And if we were to go into those situations now, it would probably blow our minds out of the water.
Or if they walked in the house.
Absolutely. I read a lot of this. From Everett Ferguson, where he talks about the worship of the 1st, 2nd century, where he has patristic evidence for it. And they would gather together. They would have a sermon. And then at the very end, they would ask anybody that's not a member of the church to leave. And then that's when they would partake of the Lord's Supper. So, and if we were to start doing something like that, people say, you know what I'm trying to say. Now, again, I want to emphasize the idea as we look at this, Ezra was to be, and the Pharisees are being commended because of their desire to hold fast to the Word of God. But we can easily start building our traditions and making that get in the way. And that's what Jesus really condemned in Matthew chapter 23. And I think, again, whenever I hear somebody throw around the word, oh, you're just a Pharisee, I sometimes think of that phrase, you don't really know what that means, do you? That's just a word that we're going to throw around to make everybody just seem extra bad. They weren't that bad except for their traditions, that's all. So as you think about this, think about that in that respect. Now, I talked about earlier, as we continue on to look at this, we talked about where Ezra fit into the Hebrew Bible. It's not included in the history books. It follows Daniel. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther follows Daniel in the book, in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, in the writings. Now, why was he not in that particular place? Well, you got to think about this. Joshua, and I kind of talked about this just a little bit, maybe this helps us to understand a little bit more. Joshua is remembered as a prophet because he was a successor to Moses. So he is the prophet. Moses was a prophet. Samuel was a prophet. Samuel also served as a judge. Eli was a priest, served as a judge. So you see all of this comes into that play there. So when you deal with specifically the monarchy books, by the way, again, the Hebrews do not have as many books in the Old Testament as we do. The Hebrew, when they were writing the language, they did not have any vowels. They would have diacritical marks to tell you what vowels fit in there. Again, part of the reason was because they had to copy it all by hand, and they would put it on papyrus or animal skin, something that would last for a period of time. Whenever the Bible was translated from Hebrew into Greek and the vowels were added, then all of a sudden what you could get in a small scroll like the Isaiah scroll that might be just very short, now all of a sudden they're tripled and quadrupled the size because the vowels are added. All right, so now that's whenever they broke up the kings. For example, we have 1st, 2nd Kings. They had 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings is called 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. And again, why was it the kings? Because that started telling about the time of the kings. 1st, 2nd Chronicles was one book. So we divided up because, again, it becomes too big for us because of, again, when they added all that in there. So that's kind of what happened. So you have now think about it, you have the monarchy books, and in the monarchy books, who is doing the main preaching? It's the prophets. You have Elijah, Elisha, you have Isaiah. So that's why they're considered to be part of the history. And that's the reason why they're added together in that respect. When you get to these other books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, when you get to Daniel and some of these others, it's added toward the end of it. Interestingly enough, the Hebrew Bible ends with the book of 2nd Chronicles. And rather than having 39 books as we have in our English Bible, their books are something like 26 because they're combining all these books together. Jeremiah and Lamentations would be one book. So that kind of helps us to understand that. Now, it's not, he does give us history in the book, and that's part of the reason why we as the English, we divide it into the history section. But his classification, because he is there to emphasize the law again, it's more of the ideal of writings. The same thing with Daniel. That's the reason why Daniel is not considered to be a part of the prophets. He's considered to be writing. All right, even though we look at it from the idea he makes predictive prophecy, but to their idea, it was the idea that he's just adding to the writings of it. All right. Now the book, as I said earlier, starts about 536. It starts with the beginning when Cyrus gave the children of Israel to captivity to allow them to come back until about the year of the reign of Artaxerxes I, about 424 BC. So somewhere in that time slot. And as I said earlier, Ezra chapter 6, Ezra chapter 7 has a 40 to 50 year time gap in it that Esther fits into. So I'm going to try to look at it chronologically that way when we go at it together. So we'll get down to the context of it. We'll see how Haggai comes on the scene, Zechariah comes on the scene. And by the way, I may spend a couple of weeks on Zechariah because Zechariah is the minor prophet in the Old Testament that has more to say about Jesus than any other. And then we think of Isaiah as the Messianic prophet. But when you look at the Messianic prophecies in Zechariah, you're sitting there thinking, when you start comparing them, Zechariah, for the length of the book, Zechariah has a whole lot more and a whole lot shorter book about Jesus than Isaiah does. So that's something to look at in that respect as well. All right? He starts talking about this idea. Now, again, we kind of talked about the contemporary political scene. The book opens with the idea, the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So now the Babylonians are out of the picture. What had happened to them? Well, we talked about that. The Babylonians, and again, Daniel chapter 2 tells us that the Babylonians were going to be superseded by the Medes and the Persians, which were going to be superseded by the Greeks. And then finally, they were going to be superseded by the Romans. The figures of Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2 fit so, and you remember this from, again, Lee's class, they fit together only in Daniel chapter 7. He describes the kingdoms as beasts, as animals, whereas in Daniel chapter 2, he's describing an image. Okay? So in the first part of this, what we're going to read in these first 6 chapters is the decree of Cyrus, allowing the children of Israel to go back to the land. We're going to read about the captives who returned to Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, we're going to see a list of the people that came back. And this very same passage, Ezra chapter 2, is going to be quoted again in Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 6 through 73. Because Nehemiah is going to be reciting all of these people that are coming back. So as you look at this, that's what's happening in all of this. So as you look at this, you're going to see a lot of similarities between both of them. And they're going to give the very same list. Then in chapter 3, they're going to talk about the worship that's going to start back, the restoration of the temple, where they again establish the foundation to start everything going back. Chapter 4 is going to talk about the Samaritans. The Samaritans. Where did they come from? Well, you've got to remember in 2 Kings chapter 17, 2 Kings chapter 25, when the Assyrians took the 10 northern tribes into captivity, they left some of the poorer people of the land, but they also did what? They moved some other people into the land that they transferred from. Okay, so they would take they would take the children of Israel who was living in this land and move them up somewhere else. And they would take some of these people that they defeated over here and move them down here. So these Samaritans came on the scene. Why? When these Jews that were left and the other people of the land started intermarrying with one another. And that sets up the whole situation of the Jews' feelings toward the Samaritans that we read about in John chapter 4. Am I going too fast?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. I just, you're taking notes, and I want to make sure I'm not trying to go so fast that you're missing anything. Okay. So as we keep thinking about that and meditating upon that, that's what's happening as we're looking at this and seeing how all this thing plays out. And I'm also trying to find my place here very quickly. Whenever I do the filler, just understand I'm trying to find my place. I've lost my place, okay?
That's fine.
So I could be honest about that. When we're preaching, we don't want to let people know, okay, I've lost my place.
Right.
So there you go. There you go. There you go. Okay. So anyway, you find the Samaritans coming on the scene, and the building of Jerusalem is opposed. And we're going to find the circumstances that happens. Chapter 5 specifically mentions Haggai and Zechariah coming on the scene. And that's where we're going to study. Ezra chapter 5, that's where we're going to study those two books, Haggai and Zechariah, when we actually get into that. And we'll probably get into some of that next week for sure, because, again, this is a 2-hour class. We can get to that point, see where we're going and what all has to happen. And then we can get into the book itself and see how he's talking and bringing out that fact. And then in chapter 6, where they're actually then allowed to rebuild the temple. We're also going to talk a lot about the idea of the temple and how God felt about the temple. Let's wait until we get there. I started to go ahead and do it now, but let's just go ahead and wait till we get there. All right. As we're back in Ezra chapter 1, we remember that Cyrus says that the kingdoms of the Lord of the earth, the Lord God of heaven, has given me. Some people ask whether or not Cyrus believed in Jehovah, Yahweh, the God of the Jews. It seems like from what we read from archaeological evidence, there are some stele, S-T-E-L-E, Cyrus, where he actually writes down what his decrees were. They have actually found many of his decrees. And it seems like this was his policy with everybody. he allowed all the captive people, not just the Jews, but everybody that was captive to go back to their own lands. And think about it this respect. When he did that, that made him loved by everybody that had been deported. So that not only were the Jews allowed to go back to Canaan land to rebuild the law or rebuild the temple, but if you were an Egyptian, you were allowed to go back to Egypt. If you were wherever you were from, you were allowed to go back. Not only that, but he also allowed, as we're going to read here, where Cyrus brings back the articles that were still from the old temple. He gives them back to the Jews so that they could take and use those articles once again in the worship of God in the new temple. Okay? But he does that with everybody. When Nebuchadnezzar took Egypt, as I said earlier, he took every idol god he found and brought it back up there to Babylon with him. And that, of course, angered the Egyptians. Whenever he allowed the Egyptians to go back, here, take your gods back. So that, that endeared him to everybody. Everybody. And I think this is part of the wisdom of his reign, was the idea of making these concessions in this respect. Then everybody would be more in line, even though they were still aggravated about the fact that they had been in captivity for this time frame. Hey, we're going back home. That's what's important. We're getting to go back home, and we're getting to try to rebuild our lives back where we're supposed to be. And I think that's part of the reason why you have so many of the people go back in this first restoration, this first return. Like I said, you're going to wind up with a number of about 41,000 people going back. But now, let's also stop and think about, why didn't all the Jews go back? They're comfortable. Even though they were captives, they were still allowed to run their own little businesses. They had their families there. Everything was going pretty good. So they're sitting back thinking, why do I need to go back? It's not like they jumped in Atlanta and they went down to Hartsfield International Airport and flew over there. A trip back to Canaan land, or a trip back to the land of Palestine, would have been at least a 4-month journey on camel and horseback. That's a long way to travel. And then when you get back, you don't even know what you got going back to. And again, this is where Nehemiah kind of helps us understand this. They had not even begun to try to rebuild the walls. They could still see where the burn marks of Nebuchadnezzar's armies, where they burnt the wall down, burnt the city down. There were some people that obviously had tried to do some things in the city, but the majority of the city of Jerusalem was still a wreck. So if you decided you were going to go back, by and large, the people that are going to go back are not the ones that are comfortable, but the ones that really want, they've not really made it that well in the land of deportation. I'm going to go back home, see if things get better back over there. And that's what they do. You have some other people that are older members, older Jews that were there when the temple was destroyed. We're going to see that whenever they dedicate the temple, that are weeping because they remember that it was like it was to begin with. So that would have meant that you got to think, if it was a 70-year captivity, they may have been 5 or 6 years old, or maybe 10 or 11, depending on how old they were when they made that journey back. And so now they remember the temple as it was, and they see the temple as it's going to be, and they're weeping because it's not the glory that they had at one time. But that would also be a reinforcement as to why they were taken into captivity to begin with. We got ourselves here. We are the only ones that can blame ourselves for this. The fact that God is allowing us to go back is something in and of itself. So all of these things come into play there. He says in verse 3, God has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. What he would do is not only allow the gods to go back, but he would also take money out of the treasury and rebuild the temples. Now again, if you're already endeared because you're going back home, and then you take money out of the treasury of Persia to rebuild the temple, well, you really are a good guy. And that gets people to be very much in love with you. So that's the idea that's going on here. It's interesting that as you go through the first few years of the American Revolution, after the American Revolution, you find that many states would pay for churches to be built. And now, now we've come full circle back the other way. You see what I'm trying to say? So you look at that, it's extremely interesting. And then he says in verse 3, who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him and let him go up to Jerusalem and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is God. Now, he's not saying he is God as opposed to all other gods. He's saying what? He is your God. And I think also he's also, maybe he was a very superstitious guy. If I get all these gods on my side, my reign will be crowned with success. So he would probably write the very same thing, and did write the very same thing as we've read through some of the archaeological inscriptions. He would write the very same things if these Egyptians were taking their gods back down to Egypt. You offer these sacrifices to your God. If every one of you guys pray to your God for me, then things, he's covering all those bases. Kind of sounds like the perfect progressive today. I'm going to cover all my bases. I'll worship and serve all these gods, and so I'll get it right somewhere, right? So that's interesting. And then he says this, and whoever is left in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, besides the free will offerings for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So if you're going to stay here, then y'all ante up and give them the cows and give them whatever they're going to need to go back. So there's the command. So at least now he's done what? Those that want to go back can. Those that want to stay can. But you have a hand. If you want to stay, you have a hand in what you're doing and what your brethren are doing. You go back and you help support this through the course of the event. And that's what they did. So then now notice, the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites. Now, when you go back and you study the division of the kingdom back in 1 Kings chapter 12, it was mainly Judah and Benjamin that made up the nation of Judah. And we talked about the idea that after a short period of time after Jeroboam reigned, the Levites by and large went back because Jerusalem was the center of worship, and that's where they knew that they had to be. So most of the people of Judah and Benjamin, as well as, who else? Priests and Levites, with all whose spirits God had moved. The word God had moved there could be translated God had stirred up, arose to go and build the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. So that's their idea. That's their goal. It's their plan. We're going to go build the house again. And so we've already seen, this was part, verse 2, of Cyrus's command. Now we see what their purpose was, just to rebuild the temple. So all those who are around them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold, goods and livestock, with precious things, besides all that were willingly offered. So King Cyrus also brought out all the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar the Lord had taken from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his gods. Cyrus brought them out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Sheshbazzar here in verse 8 is going to be referred to as Zerubbabel later on. So it's under Zerubbabel's leadership that they go back. Interestingly enough, when you read in Matthew chapter 1 of the genealogy of Jesus, Zerubbabel is mentioned. So this goes back to the idea of 2 Samuel 7. There will always be someone reigning as a king, okay? Of course, we know that the real prophecy there in 2 Samuel 7 is talking about Jesus and the eternal kingdom that he was going to set up. But some people do reference 2 Samuel chapter 7 and say, see, whenever Zerubbabel came back, he was serving as king over Israel, but he didn't serve as king, he was serving as governor. He was still answerable to Cyrus. And so it's important to look at that from that viewpoint. And it's also interesting, like I said, when you read Matthew's account, where Jesus is mentioned in the lineage, or Zerubbabel is mentioned in the lineage of Jesus, following that Judah line. So then he starts talking about all the things he brought back: 30 gold platters, 1,000 silver platters, 29 knives. Notice as we go through this list how precise they are about the pieces of furniture coming back. They're writing this down. Whenever they actually get back to Jerusalem, there is going to be a governor there, and they have to give an account for every piece that they bring back. They're going to have a piece of papyrus or something with everything listed on it, and whoever's bringing it back they have to be accountable for it. It's not like I lost it on the way. No, that's not going to work. You got to bring this back, and here's the list that's going to do that. So there's that ideal of accountability as you go through this. All the articles of gold and silver were 5,400, and these Sheshbazzar took with the captives who were brought from Babylon to Jerusalem. All right, I'm going to take, it's 8:25 now. Let's just stop there. And we'll pick up with chapter 2. Next week, we'll go into detail about God's ideal of the temple, what God said about it earlier, and the ideal of the temple whenever here. And we're going to talk about that. Then we'll go and pick back up in chapter 2 and go from there. Okay? All righty. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, but thanks for doing it. I appreciate it. I do appreciate it. Thank you.